Do you know the Betty and Barney Hill story? That's an amazing story. It's one of the very first UFO abduction stories. I think it was from 1950.
Europe, in Africa, Peru, in the United States. Well, as far as I know, this is not fake. But yeah, it's real. There's many bodies, at least 50 to 100 bodies throughout the world that are being kept.
There was something strange about the meteor shower though. Many eyewitnesses say a capsule-like fireball emerged. It was trailing fire and flanked by two smaller capsules.
Betty and Barney Hill were a married couple that lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They decided to spontaneously take a road trip, a well-earned break that Barney decided the couple needed. Barney at the time worked a grueling night shift at the post office, driving 60 miles each way. Betty's job handling state welfare cases was no easier. So after 16 months of marriage, they saw this as their delayed honeymoon, if you will. On the last night of their 3-day trip, the tired couple sipped coffee in a Vermont diner to recharge before driving back. Barney figured, hey, if we push through, we can beat the wind and the rains and the incoming hurricane. So this UFO sighting happened around 10:30 p.m. on September 19th of 1961, just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, when Betty noticed a bright point of light in the sky that moved from below the moon and the planet Jupiter upwards to the west of the moon. So while Barney was driving, Betty reasoned that she was observing a falling star, but she's like, no, it's moving upwards, that doesn't make sense. So because it was moving erratically and it was getting bigger and brighter, Betty convinced Barney to stop the car for a closer look. Barney obliged, stopped at a picnic area just south of Twin Mountain. Now by this point, Betty had dug out her binoculars for a closer look and described seeing an odd-shaped aircraft flashing multicolored lights traveling across the face of the moon, believing it to be a flying saucer based off of stories she had heard from her sister. She said, Barney, if you think that's a satellite or a star, you're being completely ridiculous. Here's the thing. He knew she was right. The Hill said they continued driving on the isolated road, moving very slowly in order to observe the object as it came even closer. So at one point, the object passed above a restaurant and signal tower on top of Cannon Mountain, and then came out near the Old Man of the Mountain. So Betty has testified that it was at least 1.5 times the length of the granite cliff profile, which was like 40 feet long, and it seemed to be rotating. At one point, the object descended rapidly towards their vehicle, causing Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. This huge, silent craft hovered about 80 to 100 feet above the Hill's 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air and filled the entire field of view in the windshield. Carrying his firearm in his pocket, Barry stepped away from the vehicle and moved closer to the object, which he later said was roughly the size of a huge pancake. Still using the binoculars, Barney claimed to have seen 8 to 11 humanoid figures peering out of the craft's windows, seemingly looking at him. In his report to investigator Walter Webb of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, otherwise known as NICAP, Barney described specifically that these beings were somehow not human. In unison, all but one figure moved to what appeared to be a panel on the rear wall of the hallway that encircled the front portion of the craft. The one remaining figure continued to look at Barney and communicated a message, telling him to stay where you are and keep looking. Barney had a recollection of observing the humanoid forms wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. Red lights on what appeared to be bat-wing fins began to telescope out of the sides of the craft, and a long structure descended from the bottom of the craft. The silent aircraft approached what Barney estimated was within 50 to 80 feet overhead and like 300 feet away from him. Now, we're about to have a moment of, wait, Alexa, you're jumping over things. Nope. Not arriving home till dawn, the Hill stated that they had some odd sensations and impulses they couldn't explain. Now they're obviously very confused, just like you are, dear viewer. And the Hills say they tried to reconstruct what exactly had happened the night before, but their memories were incomplete and fragmented. See, not just me. After sleeping for a couple of hours, Betty awoke and placed the shoes and clothing she had worn during the drive into her closet, observing that the dress was torn at the hem, the zipper, the lining, and later noted a pinkish powder on the dress. Over the years, I think at least 5 different laboratories have conducted chemical and forensic analyses on the dress and came up with nothing. Oh, this wasn't the only damage to items in their possession though. Barney says that the leather strap for the binoculars was torn, but he didn't remember how. The toes of his best dress shoes were scraped, and their watches were broken. And no matter what, they never worked again. There were shiny concentric circles, similar to the rings you'd find on a tree trunk on the car's trunk, that had definitely not been there the previous day, and Betty and Barney experimented with a compass, noting that when they moved it close to the spots, it was whirling real fast. But when they moved it a few inches away, it would relax. So 10 days after the UFO encounters, Betty began having a series of vivid dreams. This continued for 5 successive nights, and she mentioned that she experienced them with a degree of detail and intensity she'd never had in a dream before. After the 5th night, they stopped, never recurred, but they occupied her thoughts during the day. So determined to recover their lost memories, the Hills opted to partake in hypnosis sessions. So, Barney recalled driving the car away from the UFO, but afterwards he felt compelled to pull off the road and drive into the woods, eventually spotting 6 men standing on the dirt road. The car stalled and 3 of the men approached the car, telling Barney not to fear them. Obviously, Barney's still anxious, and he reported that the leader told him to close his eyes. While hypnotized, Barney said, "I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes." This was a statement he would repeat each and every session. So then, time to be brought on the ship and examination time. Betty and Barney realized that during the examinations, they removed their clothes, the alien beings that is. They plucked strands of their hair, they took clippings of their nails, they scraped their skin. Each sample was placed on a clear material, not unlike a glass slide. There were syringes connected to long wires that probed their heads, arms, legs, and spines. One particularly large one, around 4 to 6 inches long, was inserted into Betty's belly, and this left her twisting in pain. And throughout this entire time, a being that Barney and Betty called the leader watched from the side. After Betty's examination ended, the beings rushed back into her room excited. They discovered that Barney's teeth could be removed. Betty laughed, explaining that Barney had dentures, a fact of human aging the beings struggled to understand. Later, when alone with the leader, Betty asked where the craft had flown, admitting she knew very little of the universe. And the being joked with her, saying, "If you don't know where you are, there won't be any point in telling you where I am." Even though this story was so many years ago, the Hills stuck by it, despite doubts from scientists and experts. Barney passed away sadly of a stroke in 1969, and Betty was adamant. She never varied from the story until she passed away in 2004. This experience kicked off an Air Force inquiry, part of the secretive initiative Project Blue Book that investigated UFO sightings across the country. The incident would also become the first ever widely publicized alien abduction account and shape how stories like it were told and understood from then on. Now, obviously, we are in 2024, debates do continue as to whether the husband and wife were liars, if they were writing fantasy novels, or if they were just simply sleep-deprived people who later recovered seriously scrambled memories. But all in all, this story would arguably become the most famous UFO abductee story ever. One historian even said the Hills were the Adam and Eve of alien abduction stories. The couple's tale was turned into a best-selling book and a movie starring James Earl Jones, may he rest in peace, and it has provided the template for nearly every depiction of alien encounters in pop culture sense. Now, there is a new book that claims the story maybe isn't so much about aliens as it could be about race. The Hills, an interracial couple who were also very prominent civil rights activists, told a story that reflected their growing disenchantment with the slow progress of the civil rights movement at the time. At least this is a claim from historian Matthew Bowman, who wrote this in The Abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, Alien Encounters, Civil Rights, and the New Age in America. So seeing as it's almost Halloween time, Bowman's book claims to offer an unexpected racial dimension to the story. He thinks that it might have been a story of racism instead of a story of abduction. He mentioned that Barney would have struggled with racism as a black man in that time period, and that might have been a deep part of this encounter. He mentioned that when Barney was hypnotized and recovered all these memories, the language he uses was very much similar to that of those being persecuted at the time. Both Hills did recall the encounter under hypnosis, but Barney was the one who really grew terrified reliving the event. At one point, he sobbed as he recounted the UFO closing in on him, saying, "God, what is it? God, I'm scared." When you think about it, the Hills story really did change the way people regarded alien encounters. Before this, most people reported friendly encounters with UFOs and aliens. Aliens used to be these noble and giving visitors, these gods, if we're talking about like the Anunnaki theory. But the Hills added an element of horror to these stories, with the details, the gray-skinned aliens with the large head, the black eyes, the missing periods of time, the forced medical examinations. These elements became staples in so much of pop culture afterwards. Think about it. And that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya!